Hello and welcome back to Luke's Economics. In today's video, I'm going to be talking a bit about the relationship between wages and inflation. The reason for this video is because in the last video, I was talking about expenditure and how expenditure differs between low income and high income and very high income individuals. And in that video, I made an example where I was talking about an upper middle class worker who has a $100,000 salary, and he has a bundle of $50,000 which is spent on necessary goods every year. And I was talking about how the amount of money he has to spend on that necessary bundle will increase to 55, then to 60, and eventually to $80,000. And this was due to the fact that this upper middle class income worker was being outcompeted for the goods and resources by the very wealthy individual, which was driving up the price level. However, I realized that in that video, I didn't really talk about inflation or wages or I did mention inflation, but it was inflation being driven up by being outcompeted for resources by the very wealthy. And so I figured that there can be other reasons that cause inflation, and more specifically, you can see how there's a relationship between wages and inflation, and if inflation is rising but wages are rising, you're actually able to buy the same bundle of goods. But I didn't really mention that in that discussion in that video. So in this video, I'm going to talk about inflation and wages. First, starting off with what is inflation. Inflation is the rise in price levels, and interestingly enough, we can see that there is actually a desirable level of inflation according to the federal banks, which is 2%. Now, one of the reasons for this desirable level of inflation is because if you have interest rate is increasing the debt. So when a government is in debt, their interest rate will mean how much more they'll have to owe in the debt. But what counters that, or what offsets that amount of debt, is GDP growth and inflation growth. So if you happen to have GDP growth and inflation growth higher than the debt caused from interest rates, that means that the government is able to engage in more spending and can invest more to improve the life standard of its citizens, can invest in more services, can invest in more research, can invest in more buildings, can invest in all types of ways to increase the standard of living for their citizens. So this is one of the main reasons why inflation to a certain extent is desirable, because it allows the government to engage in these actions to increase the standard of living of its people. Now, moving on to wages and inflation. In this very simple example I'll explain kind of why wages and inflation are important to move in the same direction. So you have $100 and you want to purchase $100 of goods, and you can afford it perfectly. And what happens next year is inflation is at 2%, so this amount of goods is now going to cost you $102. However, your wage doesn't change, which means that you're only going to have $100 when the same amount of goods last year you were able to afford. This year you cannot. This year you can only afford 100 of the $102, or you're $2 worse off, which obviously is worse for you because it means that you're able to afford less goods. Now this matters because if wages don't rise enough to cover for this rise in inflation, for this rise in price levels, the standard of living of people will decrease because they're no longer able to afford the goods that they could before. Now, obviously in the real world, it's a lot more complex than this. People can get salaries which are well above the minimum wage, which are well above the growth rate of inflation, or the salaries may not grow at the rate of inflation, but because the salaries are so high, even if inflation were to increase, the individual is still able to purchase the same bundle of goods as before. However, it's going to cost them more of their budget. Now, if we connect this relationship between wages and inflation to the last video, the reason why this matters is because we see more and more people with this issue being the case, where their standard of living is decreasing because their wages aren't keeping up to inflation, and where they're being outcompeted by the very wealthy for the resources that they need. So obviously you can see how these two factors are kind of tied together, and we can see that essentially what happens is these two instances of being worse off by inflation, in the sense of being outcompeted by the very wealthy, and having the price level increase every year, and you're no longer able to afford the same amount of goods. They go hand in hand, and essentially they work together to push down the standard of living of the other citizens who can no longer afford the same bundle of goods. And a reason why this matters even more is because we further and further see most people, low-income earners, middle-class workers, are now in the situation where the income that they receive is now being squeezed so much that they are no longer able to afford the same bundle of goods, and their savings are decreasing, or there is no more. And essentially, we see this loss of purchasing power, of being able to purchase the same amount of goods and be able to experience the same standard of living that they were previously experiencing. And the reason for this is because these people are getting outcompeted by the very wealthy for their goods, which means that the very wealthy is therefore, as we've seen from the previous video, able to outcompete the people for their goods, able to rise the price level so they can afford it and push others out of the market, and they're able to therefore engage in more savings, which allows them to further influence policy, further generate more wealth, and be able to therefore have more power and continue building this cycle and building the spiral. And obviously, one would think, or one knows, obviously the wages are controlled by the federal government. While businesses can control wages, typically it will be salaries, but if you're looking for minimum wage, which is a lot of times used as a baseline to see how much a worker is worth per hour, you can see that the wages have not at all increased since the 1950s. In America, there's data showing that the wages corrected for inflation have remained very much the same from the 1950s till what we currently experience, which, while that is corrected for inflation, it fails to capture the impact that these people are being squeezed out of the market of other goods. And I know we have much more goods and much more technology and greater stuff available to us nowadays than we did in the past. But this is largely due to the technological advancements, which means that we should be therefore experiencing an even higher level, which we do see. But if we were to have minimum wage increase relative to inflation throughout the period, instead of it being corrected for inflation but increase on top of the correction, we'd be able to experience an even higher level of standard of livings, which would obviously further benefit society and allow us to develop and progress even more. Now, we see that an interesting study was done, I believe it was in Seattle, where instead of a minimum wage, they had a minimum salary for a standard of living to be a good standard of living, or a minimum, I believe it was like a quality of life standard of living for Seattle, and I believe they found it to be about $75,000 salary. And that salary was therefore corrected for inflation every year, so people would still be able to buy the same amount of goods. And that salary is much higher than what we see the minimum wage salary being. And the reason for this is because a lot of the times the government is either not able to spend money towards or increase the minimum wage because they don't have the funding or the resources to be able to do it, to engage in the research, the proper procedures, all of those things, as the government is becoming more and more in debt. Where they spend each dollar becomes more and more important and becomes more and more of a concern, and therefore the wage concerns may be getting pushed more and more to the back, while other issues are becoming more important as the dollars become sparser. Another reason why is because the very wealthy people make lots of money from the inequality, and therefore they're able to influence policies, they're able to lobby, they're able to put all this pressure on governments to encourage the governments to not decrease the inequality, and to not give more power and higher standards of living to the low income and other workers, because it wouldn't benefit them if they were to make such changes. So we can see that there is this kind of spiraling notion where the very wealthy are able to use their power to continue this loop to feed back and to increase their power and to increase their wealth and to increase their power and their wealth and create this sort of positive feedback loop where they just continue to get more and more and more, while the standard of living of the rest of society just falls further and further and further. And we do see this currently happening in many countries. Gary Stevenson makes videos on this happening in England, in London. We see this happening in America. We see this happening all across the world in developed countries, where the very, very wealthy are outcompeting everyone else for their resources. And currently there is not much fight or change being happened to help the rest of the people to combat and increase their standard of living. So hopefully this video was kind of able to go into detail a bit more about the previous video, expand on some topics, bring in a bit of new topics, talk about inflation and wage. As always, if you have any questions or comments, please feel free to leave them down below. They're much appreciated. Thank you very much. Good luck.